I want you to imagine a moment that feels familiar but isn't. A superpower removes a foreign leader in a single night, promises stability, promises freedom, promises prosperity, and then says something far more revealing. We might be there for years. And what just happened in Venezuela is not merely a foreign policy decision. It is a statement about how power works in the 21st century. When President Trump says the United States will oversee Venezuela, control its oil, shape its leadership, delay its democracy, he is not improvising. He is following a pattern, one where intervention is framed as rescue and control is framed as help. If you care about global order, energy politics, or the quiet erosion of sovereignty, this matters to you. Stay with me. Because before we can understand what comes next for Venezuela, we have to understand what this moment really represents and why it feels less like an ending and more like the beginning of something much longer. What exactly is the problem the United States says it is trying to solve in Venezuela? On the surface, the answer seems straightforward. A collapsed economy, an authoritarian leader removed by force, a country with vast oil reserves but broken institutions. But beneath that surface lies a more complicated reality. Venezuela today is not a blank slate. The interim government now in place is not a revolutionary break. It is, by its own critics' admission, deeply connected to the same political structures that existed under Nicolas Maduro. And yet, Washington has chosen to recognize it, to communicate with it constantly, to extract concessions from it, oil, trade terms, alignment, while leaving one question conspicuously unanswered. When will Venezuelans choose their own leaders? This is the heart of the issue. Not whether Maduro fell, but who decides what comes after. Because when elections are postponed, oil is controlled indefinitely, and legitimacy flows from foreign recognition rather than popular consent. We are no longer talking about transition. We are talking about management. And to understand why this model keeps repeating itself, we need to look backward at how Venezuela arrived at this point in the first place. To understand this moment, you have to step back, not years, but decades. Venezuela's crisis did not begin with Nicolas Maduro. It began with a system built almost entirely around oil. For generations, oil paid for everything. Social programs, political loyalty, the illusion that institutions didn't matter as long as revenue flowed. But oil economies have a cycle. When prices are high, leaders centralize power. When prices fall, systems that were never diversified begin to crack. Under Hugo Chavez and later Maduro, the state tightened its grip just as the economy weakened. Mismanagement hollowed out production. Sanctions accelerated the collapse. And the country entered a downward spiral where politics became survival. What's important here is not blame. Its mechanism. A nation dependent on one resource becomes vulnerable not just to markets but to leverage, internal and external. And when that leverage finally snaps, it creates a vacuum that someone will always rush to fill. Which brings us to the first real rupture, the moment when Venezuela's internal failure collided directly with foreign power. The rupture came suddenly, not through negotiations, not through elections, but through force. A single raid, a single night, and Nicolas Maduro was gone. In Washington, it was framed as decisive, necessary, almost surgical. But for Venezuela, it was something else entirely, a shock to the system. Because regime removal does not automatically produce legitimacy. It produces uncertainty. Within hours, an interim government was recognized, not by Venezuelans at the ballot box, but by foreign capitals. The Supreme Court, still dominated by Maduro loyalists, blessed the transition, and the United States stepped in, not just as guarantor of security, but as overseer of resources, oil sales, trade conditions, political timelines. If this feels familiar, it should. This is the paradox of modern intervention. Remove a strong man, and you inherit the state he hollowed out. If you're trying to understand why this moment matters, why it may shape Venezuela for years, this is the point to pause, reflect, and share this analysis with someone who thinks regime change is the end of the story. Because what followed the raid was not freedom. It was control quietly, bureaucratically, and indefinitely. And to grasp what that really means, we have to look beneath the surface at the system now being built behind closed doors. What's happening in Venezuela now is not chaos. It is design. Behind the language of oversight sits a familiar mechanism, one refined over decades. First, control the revenue. Oil is not just Venezuela's wealth. It is its leverage. By managing sales indefinitely, the United States holds the single lever that determines whether the state can function at all. Second, shape legitimacy. The interim leadership is not rooted in popular consent, but in recognition. Calls are made, concessions are extracted, and cooperation becomes the currency of survival. Third, delay the democratic question. Elections are neither promised nor denied. They are suspended in ambiguity, not because they are impossible, but because uncertainty keeps power flexible. This is how modern influence works. Not through flags and governors, but through contracts, approvals, and quiet dependencies. And here's the deeper truth. This system does not require bad intentions. It only requires incentives. Stability over legitimacy, access over autonomy, predictability over participation. Once this structure is in place, it becomes very hard to unwind, because every step towards sovereignty feels, to those in control, like a risk. And that tension between control and consent is about to surface again, more visibly, more dangerously. The second crisis did not explode in Caracas. It erupted in Washington. As the United States deepened its role abroad, resistance surfaced at home. Quietly at first. Then formally, the Senate voted to invoke the War Powers Act, a rare move and a revealing one. Not because it would immediately stop anything, but because it exposed a fracture inside American power itself. On one side, an executive branch acting with speed, confidence, and ambiguity. On the other, lawmakers asking an uncomfortable question. How long can a president commit the nation to a foreign entanglement without consent? This matters more than it seems, because foreign interventions don't just reshape the countries they touch. They test the institutions that launch them. The vote was narrow, its impact largely symbolic. A veto still looms. But symbolism is not nothing. It signals unease about duration, about cost, about precedent. And while Washington debates process, Venezuela remains suspended in outcome. Its future tethered not to ballots, but to boardrooms, briefings, and back channels. This is how long interventions begin. Not with declarations of permanence, but with moments of hesitation that fail to turn into restraint. And as elites argue over authority, the consequences travel downward, away from chambers and offices into daily life. That is where this story now leads. If you are Venezuelan, this moment doesn't feel abstract. It feels personal, because while leaders debate oversight and leverage, you are living inside the pause. The pause between regimes. The pause between promises and reality. More than 800 political prisoners remain behind bars. Families wait. Careers are frozen. Lives are held in suspension. You are told reconstruction is coming, that oil revenues will return. That stability requires patience. But patience is easier when you are not the one waiting for freedom. For many, this new phase feels unsettlingly familiar. The same structures, the same courts, the same voices, only now answering to different powers. And yet, hope refuses to disappear, because people like Maria Corina Machado insist this process is irreversible. Because the idea of choice, real choice, has not died. If you believe that democracy is more than a slogan, this is the moment to pay attention, to ask hard questions, to keep watching. History often turns not when power speaks loudly, but when ordinary people refuse to look away. And what happens next will not stay confined within Venezuela's borders. What happens in Venezuela never stays in Venezuela, because this is not just a national experiment. It is a global signal. Energy markets are watching closely. When the world's largest proven oil reserves come under indefinite foreign control, price stability becomes political. Supply becomes strategy. So do allies, so do rivals. If Washington can remove a leader, manage resources, and delay elections, all while calling it oversight, others will take notes. Not just about Venezuela, but about the rules themselves. For countries sitting atop strategic assets, the message is clear. Sovereignty today is conditional. It depends on alignment, compliance, and usefulness. And for regions already fragile, this sets off a chain reaction. Neighboring states recalibrate. Non-aligned nations hedge. Great powers quietly expand their own spheres. In response, this is how global order shifts. Not through dramatic announcements, but through precedents. Venezuela has become one, a test case for a world where intervention is managerial, not colonial, yet no less consequential. And as this model spreads, the most important question is no longer who holds power today. It is what kind of future this logic makes inevitable. That brings us to the crossroads, the paths that now lie ahead. From here, Venezuela faces three possible futures. None of them are clean. All of them are shaped by choices being made right now. The first is the optimistic path. Oversight gives way to elections. Oil revenues are restored transparently. Political prisoners are released. Legitimacy is transferred, not managed. In this scenario, foreign involvement becomes a bridge, not a destination. Short, stabilizing, and then gone. The second is the muddled middle. Elections are delayed but promised. Oil flows, but under conditions. Institutions reform slowly, selectively. Life improves just enough to reduce pressure, but not enough to restore trust. Venezuela survives, but does not fully recover. Neither sovereign nor occupied, just suspended. The third is the darkest path. Oversight hardens into dependency. Control becomes routine. Democracy becomes procedural theater. The state exists, but answers elsewhere, and leaving becomes harder than staying. History suggests the middle path is the most likely, because it is the most comfortable for those with power, but systems drift unless pushed. And the direction of that drift depends on whether legitimacy is eventually allowed to reassert itself. The future, in other words, is still open, but not for long. This is not just a story about Venezuela. It is a story about the world we are building, a world where power no longer needs to conquer to control, where intervention is framed as management, where democracy is promised eventually. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and if there is one lesson here, it is this. Systems that postpone legitimacy rarely intend to restore it quickly. Venezuela may yet find its way to freedom, but the longer decisions are made elsewhere, the harder that path becomes. For the United States, this moment will echo far beyond Caracas. Every future intervention will point back here and say, this worked. For you watching this unfold, the question is not whether reconstruction will be profitable. It is whether it will be just. If you want to understand how power is changing, how economics, energy, and democracy are being quietly rewired, follow this story. Share it, stay engaged, because the most dangerous shifts in global order are the ones that happen without resistance. And this is only the beginning.